October 7, 1916, 2:30 a.m. The Western Front in France erupts in thunder as British shells scream through the darkness toward German positions near the Somme. In a makeshift dugout carved from mud and desperation, a 27-year-old Austrian dispatch runner named Adolf Hitler crouches over his maps when the world explodes around him. Shell fragments tear through his left thigh as the blast hurls him against the collapsing earthen walls. 2 months later, this wounded soldier would arrive at a pristine medical complex hidden in the pine forests outside Berlin, a place that would witness the darkest chapters of the 20th century and become home to horrors that refuse to die. Beelitz-Heilstätten rises from the Brandenburg wilderness like something from a fever dream. 60 buildings of red brick and Gothic towers, connected by underground tunnels and elevated walkways, stretching across 200 hectares of dense forest. Built in 1898 as Europe's most advanced tuberculosis sanatorium, this self-contained medical city housed 1,200 patients in an era when lung disease meant certain death. The architects designed it as a cathedral to healing. Soaring archways, ornate balconies where patients could breathe the forest air, and surgical wings equipped with the most modern medical technology of its time. But beneath its beautiful facade, something sinister was growing. When the Great War erupted, Beelitz transformed overnight into a military hospital for the Imperial German Army. The peaceful wards that once echoed with the coughs of tuberculosis, patients now groaned under the weight of battlefield casualties. Young men arrived by the thousands, their bodies shattered by machine guns, their lungs seared by mustard gas, their minds broken by the mechanized horror of modern warfare. Among them was Private Hitler, who spent 2 months recovering from his leg wound in these very halls, staring out at the forest canopy from his hospital bed, perhaps dreaming of the empire he would one day try to build. But Hitler's recovery was just the beginning. When he rose to power 2 decades later, Beelitz-Heilstätten became something far more sinister than a hospital. During World War II, the complex transformed into a Nazi medical bunker, a place where wounded SS officers received treatment while Allied bombs fell on Berlin. The underground surgical wings buzzed with activity as Nazi doctors worked frantically to patch up the remnants of Hitler's crumbling war machine. The same corridors where the future Führer had once hobbled on crutches now echoed with the jackboots of his followers. April 25, 1945, 4:15 a.m. Soviet artillery shells whistle through the dawn as the Red Army closes its iron grip around Berlin. 30 miles southwest, in the forest surrounding Beelitz-Heilstätten, the sound of gunfire grows closer with each passing hour. The Nazi medical staff can hear the rumble of Soviet tanks approaching through the trees. Inside the surgical bunkers, German doctors perform desperate operations by flickering electric light, knowing that their world is about to end. When Soviet forces finally overrun the complex, they discover more than just a hospital. They find a monument to the Third Reich's medical barbarism, complete with underground operating theaters and research facilities that would make their blood run cold. The Soviets claimed Beelitz-Heilstätten as spoils of war, converting it into the largest military hospital outside the USSR. For the next 50 years, the complex would serve as a fortress of Soviet medicine, treating everyone from common soldiers to high-ranking Communist Party officials. But the ghosts of its Nazi past refused to stay buried. Soviet doctors and nurses working the night shifts began reporting strange phenomena in the abandoned surgical wings. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors, operating room lights flickering on by themselves, the sound of German voices calling out in the darkness. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, a Soviet surgeon who worked at Beelitz in the 1960s, would later describe hearing the phantom sounds of medical equipment, ventilators wheezing, heart monitors beeping, coming from operating rooms that had been sealed for years. Soviet guards patrolling the underground tunnels reported seeing figures in white coats moving through the shadows, only to find the corridors empty when they investigated. The most disturbing reports came from the former Nazi surgical bunkers, where Soviet staff claimed to hear screaming in German echoing from behind locked doors. The haunting grew worse as the years passed. Soviet personnel working in the psychiatric wing reported encounters with apparitions of Nazi doctors still performing operations on invisible patients. Security cameras installed in the 1970s captured unexplained movement in supposedly empty sections of the hospital. Night shift workers began refusing assignments in certain wings, claiming they could feel the presence of the dead pressing against them in the darkness. The Soviet military command, typically dismissive of superstition, quietly reassigned staff away from the most problematic areas. By the 1980s, Beelitz-Heilstätten had developed a reputation among Soviet forces as a place where the living and the dead coexisted uneasily. Medical personnel whispered stories of ghostly Nazi officers appearing in surgical theaters, of spectral patients wandering the wards, of voices speaking in perfect German echoing through the ventilation systems. The hospital's commanders tried to suppress these stories, but they spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some Soviet soldiers refused to enter certain buildings after dark, claiming they could hear the march of phantom Wehrmacht boots on the floors above. The final chapter of Beelitz-Heilstätten's Soviet era brought new horrors that had nothing to do with ghosts. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall crumbled and the Soviet Empire collapsed, a serial killer known as the Beast of Beelitz began stalking the forests around the hospital complex. Wolfgang Schmidt, a 6'3" transgender woman with an obsession with pink lingerie, murdered 5 women and an infant in the shadows of the abandoned Nazi buildings. The killer's crimes seemed to feed off the malevolent energy that had accumulated in this place over decades of death and suffering. December 1990. The infamous East German dictator Erich Honecker, dying of liver cancer, arrives at Beelitz-Heilstätten for treatment. The same hospital that once healed the young Hitler now tends to another German dictator in his final days. Honecker spends his last months in the same complex where Nazi doctors once conducted their experiments, where Soviet surgeons reported ghostly encounters, where a serial killer had recently stalked his victims through the forest. The irony is almost too perfect. 2 German tyrants, separated by half a century, finding refuge in the same haunted halls. When the Soviets finally abandoned Beelitz-Heilstätten in 1994, they left behind more than just empty buildings. They left a place saturated with the psychic residue of nearly a century of human suffering. The 60 structures that had once housed the hopes and dreams of tuberculosis patients, the screams of wounded soldiers, the machinations of Nazi doctors, and the fears of Soviet staff now stood empty in the Brandenburg forest, their windows like dead eyes staring out at the world. Urban explorers who ventured into the abandoned complex in the years following the Soviet withdrawal reported experiences that defied rational explanation. Photography equipment malfunctioned in certain areas. Digital cameras captured unexplained figures in the background of images. Visitors described sudden temperature drops in specific rooms, the sensation of being watched, and voices speaking in multiple languages: German, Russian, and others they couldn't identify. The underground surgical bunkers, sealed since the Nazi era, seemed to emanate a palpable sense of dread that made even hardened urban explorers reluctant to explore them fully. The most disturbing reports came from the former psychiatric wing, where explorers claimed to encounter the ghost of a Nazi doctor still making his rounds. Witnesses described a tall figure in a white coat moving methodically from room to room, checking on patients who were no longer there. When approached, the figure would turn and stare with empty sockets where eyes should have been before dissolving into the shadows. Some explorers reported finding medical instruments arranged in precise patterns in rooms that had been empty for decades, as if invisible hands were still preparing for surgeries that would never come. The supernatural activity intensified after dark, leading many to believe that the spirits trapped within Beelitz-Heilstätten were most active when the living world slept. Security guards hired to protect the property during attempted privatization efforts in the late 1990s routinely quit after encountering unexplained phenomena. One guard reported watching an entire surgical team perform an operation in a room that had been stripped of all equipment decades earlier. He could see their movements clearly, but the operating table remained empty. Film crews arriving to shoot movies like The Pianist and Valkyrie reported technical difficulties that seemed to center around the former Nazi surgical areas. Lights would fail without explanation. Cameras would capture strange shadows and unexplained figures, and crew members reported feeling physically ill when working in certain sections of the complex. The filmmakers learned to schedule their shooting during daylight hours and avoid the underground areas entirely. Today, portions of Beelitz-Heilstätten have been converted into tourist attractions, complete with a treetop walkway that allows visitors to observe the abandoned buildings from above. But the darkest secrets of this place remain hidden in the sealed surgical bunkers beneath the forest floor. Local guides working at the site report that visitors frequently ask about the ghost stories, drawn by the same morbid fascination that has attracted urban explorers for decades. Some tourists claim to experience unexplained sensations during their visits. Sudden chills, the feeling of invisible hands touching them, voices whispering in their ears. The few sections of the complex that remain in medical use, now serving patients with Parkinson's disease and other neurological conditions, exist in uneasy coexistence with the abandoned areas. Staff members working in these active facilities report strange occurrences that echo the experiences of their Soviet predecessors. Equipment turning on by itself, voices in empty rooms, the sensation of being watched while working alone at night. The boundary between the living hospital and the dead one seems to blur in the darkness. As night falls over the Brandenburg forest, Beelitz-Heilstätten transforms into something far more sinister than a mere abandoned hospital. In the surgical bunkers where Nazi doctors once worked their dark medicine, in the corridors where Soviet staff encountered phantom German voices, in the rooms where a serial killer's victims drew their final breaths, the past refuses to remain buried. The dead of 3 different eras, tuberculosis patients from the sanatorium years, Nazi officers from the war period, and Soviet personnel from the Cold War, seem to coexist in these haunted halls, their spirits bound together by the shared trauma of this cursed place. Investigators who have spent nights in the abandoned sections of Beelitz-Heilstätten report a phenomenon they call temporal bleeding, moments when the barriers between past and present seem to dissolve. They describe hearing the sounds of medical procedures from different eras occurring simultaneously. The primitive surgical tools of the tuberculosis era, the advanced Nazi medical equipment of the 1940s, and the Soviet-era machinery of the Cold War period. It's as if all the hospital's dark history is playing out at once in an endless, nightmarish loop. The underground bunkers, sealed since the Soviet era, remain the epicenter of the supernatural activity. Urban explorers who have managed to access these areas describe an overwhelming sense of malevolence that seems to emanate from the very walls. The air itself feels thick with the accumulated suffering of decades, making it difficult to breathe and causing many visitors to flee in panic. Those brave enough to remain report hearing the sounds of medical procedures being conducted in German, the clatter of surgical instruments, and the moans of patients in languages spanning nearly a century of occupation. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the reports of temporal displacement experienced by some visitors. Multiple witnesses have described entering rooms in the abandoned hospital and finding themselves momentarily transported to different time periods, seeing the facility as it appeared during its tuberculosis sanatorium days, its Nazi medical bunker period, or its Soviet military hospital era. These experiences last only seconds, but they leave visitors shaken and confused, unsure of what century they're truly in. The forest surrounding Beelitz-Heilstätten has absorbed decades of human trauma, and locals claim that the very trees seem tainted by the darkness that has occurred within their shadows. Hikers report feeling watched while walking the trails around the complex, as if unseen eyes are tracking their movement from the broken windows of the abandoned buildings. Some have reported encountering ghostly figures in the forest itself. Phantom patients from the sanatorium era wandering among the pines, spectral Nazi officers moving through the undergrowth, Soviet soldiers eternally patrolling their abandoned posts. As dawn breaks over the Brandenburg wilderness, the supernatural activity gradually subsides, and Beelitz-Heilstätten returns to its deceptive appearance as merely another abandoned hospital complex. But those who have experienced its nighttime horrors know the truth. This place exists as a nexus where the darkest chapters of German history converge, where the ghosts of 3 different eras refuse to rest. and where the boundary between the living and the dead has become permanently blurred. In the sealed surgical bunkers beneath the forest floor, in the empty corridors where phantom voices still echo, in the operating theaters where invisible hands continue their grisly work, the Nazi medical bunker at Beelitz-Heilstätten stands as a testament to the truth that some places are too haunted by history to ever truly die. The complex remains a pilgrimage site for those drawn to the intersection of history and the supernatural, a place where visitors can walk through the remnants of a tuberculosis sanatorium, a Nazi medical facility, and a Soviet military hospital, all within the same crumbling walls. But they come at their own risk, for Beelitz-Heilstätten has proven that some ghosts are too numerous, too angry, and too deeply rooted in trauma to ever be exorcised. In this forest outside Berlin, the dead outnumber the living, and the past refuses to remain buried beneath the Brandenburg soil.